Local 514 sat down for an interview with Beverly Jacobs, the senior advisor to the president of the University of Windsor on Indigenous relations and outreach. Jacobs discussed with Local 514 actions that could be implemented by the federal government to better address the missing murdered Indigenous women, girls, Two Spirit, and trans folks emergency in Canada. To hear more, stay tuned for the whole interview.
Right.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you, Beverly, again for your time. Could you please just state your name and your title?
Okay, yep. Beverly Jacobs. I'm Mohawk from Six Nations Grand River Territory. And right now I'm the senior advisor to the president at the University of Windsor on Indigenous relations and outreach.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Beverly. So the House of Commons is interested in putting forward a motion to recognize and declare missing and murdered Indigenous women as a national emergency. Do you have any sort of initial thoughts on this?
Well, I would say it's about time, but it's also you can state it, but what are the actions that they're going to do to implement it, and what are the resources that have been declared, since Amnesty's report, the Stolen Sisters report from that time. So that was 2004, when there was already a call out then that there was a crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And there's been a call for 30 years from the women from the downtown east side. So yes, it's about time, but it's also, there's been inquiries, there's been commissions, there's been recommendations, calls to action, calls for justice. And if that's one of the implementation, it's what are the resources that they're going to provide in order for something to actually be on the ground. So, for the families when they're calling out, where do they go? Like there's no central place, there's no central emergency call out to say, what do I do? Where do I go? Who do I talk to? Who can help me? And it's difficult sometimes when police is also part of the problem and they're not willing to listen sometimes. So it depends again on the relationship that's built with Indigenous peoples, because sometimes the police are right on and they do maybe sometimes do what they need to do, but then nothing's followed through, or it's done differently, or families are having to do it on their own because they've stopped doing the searches if someone's missing. And there's a difference between someone who goes missing and someone who is found murdered, right, for the needs for the family. So there's just so much that's needed for the families who are having to live through it on a daily basis.
Would you say in Canada, especially more recently, there's been a history of, somewhat of recognition, but this isn't followed through with tangible action?
They have not acknowledged that it's genocide. They have not acknowledged that it is a process of genocide, and that Canada's actions have caused this. So when you think about the history of Canada, the history of the Indian Act, the history of stolen land, of all of the things that they've done to try to erase us as a people, they've never acknowledged that they are the root of the problem. So if they acknowledge that they are the problem and the root of the problem, it's like an abuser, right? When someone is an abuser, that they've acknowledged the harm that they've done, and that they're willing to do whatever it is to repair the harm. So if Canada is willing to say that um, they've caused and have created the genocide and said, okay, I accept responsibility for that, and so I'm going to do whatever it takes to restore the harm and to restore um, the lives of Indigenous peoples, right? And we're talking generations, generational, intergenerational, ongoing. Um, so, what are they going to do to make sure that our women are safe? It's a big question, because they have the resources and they should be providing them to the communities on the ground that are doing the work, right? They're the families that are doing the work, um, community, allies, right? They're so, and that's one of the things that I've seen since I started working with Amnesty International on the Stolen Sisters report, was the awareness. The awareness within our communities has grown. The grassroots movement has grown to identify this as a national crisis, as an international crisis. Um, and so, in acknowledging what's happening on, on the ground and grassroots and land protectors, um, land defenders, water defenders, like this is all related. It's all related to the same thing and the root of colonization and genocide. And if Canada is willing to repair that harm, then we need to see it. And if this is the first step of using this as a national alert, then again, what does it mean? What are they going to do? How is it going to be implemented? Um, that's the big question still.
Um, what do you think it would look like for the government to try and repair this harm in history?
Well, I think there's been enough inquiries, um, royal commissions, truth and reconciliation commissions, MMIW inquiries. There's even been provincial inquiries on the justice system, on so many issues. All they need to do is implement them and put the resources into all of the calls that have been made. That's all they need to do. And if we can see it, that they're actually doing it, then to me, it's the actions that follow that's meaningful to me, and and that if they're willing to do that, and we can see it and we can feel it and we know that women are being protected, to me that's the measure of success. That's the measure of that change is happening, that I don't have to be worried about my own safety as
Um,
an Indigenous woman. I'm
mhm.
saying.
Um, when you mentioned that, there's been so many inquiries, so many reports, um, do you think that this is kind of a method of distraction in terms of, if someone asks, okay, well, government, what are you doing? And they're like, well, we have this report, we have that.
Mhm.
Like it's kind of a method or a way to kind of show that they're doing something without actually really doing something.
Yeah, I think it's a diversion for sure. And they really like to manipulate. They like to manipulate, the things that they do that really don't mean a lot. Um, by putting a couple $1,000s here and there and announcing things like that when, it's trillions of dollars that they need to put back into our communities in order for us to regain and revitalize um, who we are as a people, right? So, residential school being one of them, right? That's the root of a lot of the violence in our communities is because of the enforced genocidal policies of sending our children to residential school. And so, what are they doing in order to rectify the harm that they've done? Um, and they like to manipulate. Yeah, we put how many millions of dollars into a settlement agreement, um, but um, where are the systemic changes? Where are the changes that need to occur in the system, in whether it's education or legal or social systems, right? Those are the real shifts and changes that need to happen. Not just throwing money somewhere and thinking that's going to help. There
Absolutely.
has to be some kind of post um, uh, processes to determine whether there has been success. Because right now, when you're looking at the systems, it's it's not working. When you have the highest number of Indigenous people in prisons, when you have the highest number of people who are in the children who are in the child welfare system, right? So, um, what is being built in order to make sure that they don't end up there? Um, they're making big bucks on our people within those systems. Um, they're not looking at it in a different way, like a decolonized way.
Would you say that the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, and the high representation of Indigenous children in the foster care system and people in the prison system, all of these are kind of interconnected in representing
They're
on.
totally connected,
Mhm.
totally connected, because it's all related to the erasure of of our people. Colonization hasn't ended. People think that it's ended, but it hasn't. We still have the highest number of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and it's a crisis. We're at critical levels of loss. Um, so yeah, it's hard. It's harsh, thinking about all of that, and we're still having to deal with that. But I also look at the flip side of things. That's all the negative stuff. The flip side is looking at all of um, the resilience of our people, of our women, um, of the strengths that we have as a people, that we've maintained who we are despite all of that. Um, I like to highlight that because, we still have our language speakers, we still have our ceremonies, we still have connection to our lands and our territories and our languages, even though, where some are at extinction levels. Um, but at the same time, our people maintained all of that, and I always honor our knowledge holders, and the ones who kept our language and kept our ceremonies and kept all of our legal orders, what I call, within our communities to maintain our identity. That's how I was raised to understand that. So, just thinking about all of the people, all of the knowledge holders and growing up in my lifetime who have helped me to survive, right? Who have helped me to keep my strength, and um, in order for me to deal with all of the crap, like all of this stuff that we're dealing with MMIW and residential schools and the child welfare system, just the realities of what's happening in our communities.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. I wanted to ask, so some activists are pushing for a red dress alert system, which would kind of be I mean, you know about it, but a specific method for our tool for people to report cases of missing Indigenous women and girls. Do you think that this would be helpful, or kind of like a helpful start?
For sure, I think anything that brings attention, um, anything that brings the attention is going to be helpful. And again, it's like, yeah, you can bring the alerts, but what's the process in order to deal with it immediately, right? So I hope they planned that. I hope they figured out how that works.
Thank you. I've noticed that you've attended various vigils for missing and murdered Indigenous women. Is there anything that you've noticed about the presence of politicians at these vigils, and maybe kind of the presence versus following these vigils, lack of action or support in kind of any way?
Yeah, photo ops are really good for them, and that's what they like to do. So I think the last time I was on the Hill for one of the Sisters in Spirit uh, vigils, and I think Trudeau came to the podium, and I stood in the back. I stood in the back and I watched. I did watch whether the influence of politicians um, have any influence. I think they have an influence in their manipulation to the public, right? So people who support them say, "Oh, look, they're there, they're supporting, they have kind words, they have good words to say." Um, they're I'm really good at watching, just watching what the intentions of people, and um, that's something that I've acknowledged is something that I do, and I really pay attention to. Um, I really pay attention to the truth, or to um, whether it's meaningful or not. Because now I've consciously put myself in spaces where I believe that there will be changes or shifts or things that help our people. So politicians are voted in for how many years, right? They have a few years for their mandates. And so they're good at the manipulation. They're good at the photo ops, and they're good at making sure they're in a space where their faces will be seen. And the people who they latch onto for photo ops. Um, to me, that means nothing. That doesn't mean anything. It was like the residential school apology. It didn't mean anything unless there's action. And that was my response then when I was president of NWAC, and saying, you can apologize all you want. Yeah, thank you very much. But what are you going to do about it? What are your actions? What can I see where I know there will be change? So that's always been um, uh, my intentions for everything that I do, is to ensure that everything I do, that's something that I think about the future generations and what's going to make the changes for 7 generations from now. Everything I do, whether it's personally, publicly, professionally. Um, I don't know whether they think the same. I don't think they think the same way, because they think what they can do in the 3 years that they are in their positions of power, um, which is different than what I'm saying. Um, yeah. So I've gone to the UN. I've gone to do interventions at the UN, even during the height of my term, while I was president of the Native Women's Association of Canada and the MMIW, bringing attention back then. And I just remember the manipulation of Canada at the UN, and the manipulation of the words that they like to use, um, to say this is what we're doing for Indigenous people. Yeah. And it's frustrating, because then the world thinks that Canada is such a good country, and how it treats its Indigenous peoples, when in fact it's totally opposite.
Could you elaborate on this a little bit more? Like, would you kind of say this connects to not upholding UNDRIP, like things like this?
Yeah, I mean, that is a major part of um, because I was also there at the UN when the UN declaration was passed, when Canada and the US and Australia and New Zealand all said no. And it was embarrassing. It was embarrassing because I knew, globally, on a global scale, we, as Indigenous people, so other Indigenous people from the other countries, um, you know, apologizing for them. I'm sorry that Canada is the way that it is. I'm sorry that you have to live in that place called Canada. Um, so even the rights that are included in the UN declaration, I like to call it UN drip rather than undrip, um, just because of uh, I always think about language. Um, so, with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it's still one more tool, I suppose, that we can use as Indigenous people. But Canada still manipulates. They still have not actually done the work to ensure that our rights are protected. I mean, there's Section 35 in the Constitution Act that's been there since 1982, but they still haven't recognized the right to self-determination. So, and that's the first article of um, the UN DRIP.
I just have one last question for you.
Yeah.
I saw that in 2018, you said that you were initially supportive of the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women, but that you no longer supported it as it re-traumatized families. Could you elaborate on this a little bit?
Well, the first part, it was exciting, right? When we knew that there was going to be an inquiry, and my hopes were that it would educate the public about what I'm just saying about the underlying root causes of genocide, that the public would be um, educated. But it went off on a really horrible start with, you know, all the negative attention, um, people who were leaving, people who weren't staying, um, and it took over a year before it actually, before we actually saw some of the things that were happening. And I was involved with families in First Nation, in my community especially, um, but other family members as well, who felt that um, they were not being included. So it created a division amongst families, sadly. And because they did have a national family circle that was part of the inquiry, and all the respect to them. They're powerful family members you know who were given a voice but there were some families who didn't, and those were the ones that I heard from, and it was sad. um, there were so many different issues with the inquiry. um, they didn't go into any First Nations communities. They didn't. um, uh, there were select cities where they went into. um, and like I said, like the things that they were able to do in the amount of time that they were given, um, there were so many limitations and barriers. um, but I really respected the report that came out about the genocide, um, that came out at uh, in their reporting. um, so yeah, there were times in the beginning of the inquiry where I was really, really disappointed, and really, because I was protecting the families that I was hearing from, and they felt like they didn't have a voice. So um, sadly, it did become a really frustrating time, when in the beginning, I was so hopeful that um, it would bring that attention that's needed and required for all of society to understand, and it didn't happen. And it was actually the negative attention that people saw, and that people during those times in the beginning.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you want to bring up or recommend that I look?
um, I don't think so. I think I said a lot.
Thank you so much for your time. I really
Yeah.
appreciate you taking the time to speak with me about this.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks a lot. And
I'll,
are you
yeah,
you're um you're in Montreal,
yeah,
you
I'm
said?
in Montreal.
Yeah. I'm not sure if you talked to Ellen Gabriel, but she's around there too. She would
Mhm.
be a good person to talk to about it too.
Wonderful. Yeah, I
yeah.
reached out to her yesterday. I'm just awaiting a response.
Okay.
But yes, she has a strong presence here, so I'm hoping that I can connect.
Okay, good.
Thank you
She's
for.
my good friend.
Okay,
Yeah.
wonderful
Okay.
to hear that. Thank you again, and I'll keep you up to date with the release. But if there's any questions you have for me
Yeah.
or anything you want to add, don't hesitate to reach out.
Okay. All right.
Have a
Okay.
lovely
Thanks
rest of your day,
so much.
okay?
Yeah, you too. Bye.
Bye.